Okay, thank you very much for having me here. This is probably a little more preliminary than most other papers, but maybe we're having a horse race here. So the paper is about trying to connect educational policies and intergenerational mobility. It's joined with a student at Wisconsin, Tomo, who's sitting right there. Okay, so Chetty et al., 2014, presents measures of rank-rank correlation in the states of the United States. So what they show is, so imagine you were to just arrange individuals on the basis of their income, parental income, and then ask the percentiles of the parent income, and then ask what's the mean percentile rank of the children's income. And then you have a slope of that line, and they think of that as a measure of intergenerational mobility, which has some nice properties relative to, say, the IGE. There's substantial variation across the states of the United States. Okay, so for instance, in the state of California, the rank-rank correlation is like 0.23, or Utah is like 0.244. Much higher rank-rank correlation numbers in, say, Mississippi or Louisiana. Okay, so if the parent's percentile rank was 10 percentile points higher, in California, the kid's percentile rank would be like 2 percentiles higher, where it would be 4 in Mississippi. Okay. So the question we're after is what factors can kind of generate this variation across states? Okay, and hopefully, following Ronnie's comment, the number is a bit less than 100%. We do find it's considerably less than 100%. Okay, so what we're going to look at is the following. We're going to look at variation in public school educational policy across the states of the United States. And we believe that this has the potential to account for this enormous spread in the rank-rank correlation. Okay, so in some sense, the motivation for this paper comes from an important work by Jim with Flavio and others in trying to think about early investments in children being critical. There's a nice paper by Cockett and Lochner where they demonstrate that if you, in a structural setting, in an intergenerational setting with life cycle and intergenerational model, where if you actually give young parents with young kids, $10,000, it has a much stronger effect on wages later in life than, say, giving it later. Okay, so we think public school spending at the elementary and secondary stage could play an important role here. We're going to consider 3 differences in terms of public school spending across school districts. The level might vary. The financial systems would vary, the school finance systems, which varies considerably across states, and the distribution of spending, which in our model will come from the distribution of income of the parents. Okay, so we're going to construct a dynamic model. It's just going to be 2 periods. It's going to be just a parents and kids generations, not an overlapping generations, but the three key ingredients in the model. So there's going to be investments in kids early and late. And that's the child's human capital formation. There's going to be disutility from inequality. So I want to see how people think about this. So there's going to be variation in tastes across states in order to account for this massive variation in educational spending across states. And then we're going to have a model, nest that in a model in which districts actually vote over the tax rate.
Can't you get 100% with disutility from it?
Unfortunately, no. No, in terms of, so the argument is how we can get 100% of the variation in educational spending, but in terms of what the contribution is of educational policy, that's not going to be 100%, right? And in fact, to be honest, when we set up the paper, we thought this disutility from inequality might play an important role. It does play an important role in accounting for the variation in spending across states. But it doesn't play as important role in the bottom line figure in terms of the decomposition, how much of the variation is accounted for by educational policy. Okay, so the model captures the data pretty well, at least in terms of the moments that we actually don't seek to match. The 3 aspects of public school spending we think are important to understand intergenerational mobility. And I think the pretty preliminary counterfactual simulations suggest that the distribution of public school spending, which comes from the distribution of income, as well as educational policy, has a fairly substantial impact on intergenerational mobility. Okay, so there is considerable work on intergenerational mobility, and typically the literature employs intergenerational elasticities, as the previous paper was employing. So Becker gave a presidential address, I believe in '83, where AEA presidential address, and he described America as a very mobile society. If you measure the correlation between, say, 1-year or 2-year averages of parent income and kids' income, the correlation is like 0.2 or 0.25. And then you have these papers by Solon and Zimmerman arguing that if you use 5-year averages of earnings, that number jacks up to like 0.5, and Bosch Mazumdar, who used like 15-year averages of parent and kids' earnings, that number goes up to 0.6. So it kind of matters when you measure it over the life cycle. So these are called life cycle biases in measuring IGs. There's work on, in the cross-country context by Miles Korak, trying to get these comparable estimates across countries. And then the paper we're going to rely on a lot is the Chetty et al. Data. We actually initially thought we could get access to the microdata. I guess that'll take like a year and a half, and depends on what kind of ideas we have, which are not great anyway to begin with. But it's a long-range process to actually get access to this idea. In addition, there's also a literature on public school finance systems. And the paper we're going to draw on pretty heavily is Fernandez and Rogers in 2003. And actually, Betsy is the one I think who taught me that paper at Rochester, where they kind of categorize these different school finance systems and see what the impact of those school finance systems are going to be. Okay, so where do we get the data from? The rank is going to come from Chetty, as is child income data. So Chetty has these kids born between 80 and 82. So the kids are going to be going to school in the US between 82 and like 2000. And then there's income data on these kids, and then they grow up as well. That's all that's coming from Chetty. And we have these measures of rank slope coefficients in each of the states in the United States. Then there's public school spending data that's going to come from the US Census Bureau, and what exactly is the educational policy in each of these states? That's going to come from the American Education Finance Association. Okay, so what do the data look like in terms of educational expenditure inequality within and across states?
So this is public expenditure.
This is public spending.
So there's also a lot of these states vary enormously in their private sector, right?
Yep.
Like Catholic schools and also affluent secular schools.
True.
I mean, isn't that part of the story? I mean, I don't know.
And it is part of the story, and it is part of the model as well.
Okay.
It's hard to get systematic data on how this varies, especially the distribution of private school spending across states. There is some data available. But if you're aware of any sources where you have like state-specific private school expenditure data, I'd be interested in knowing about that.
I think you can get Catholic expenditure from the
Just Catholic?
ISD. I don't know about the private. I don't know. I haven't looked recently.
But you'll see, I think it does play an important role, because you have these public inputs and private inputs,
Right.
and we're not going to assume they're perfect substitutes. So it does play an important role.
Yeah. Well, it's just that people can escape. Like
A bad public
Washington, D.C. It's got the worst school system in the world, in the country anyway. And very few of the politicians' children who live there actually are going to public schools. Right? Same is true in Chicago.
Yeah, it's there in the model as well. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have, so this is data on educational expenditure inequality. Let's look at the Thiel index of inequality. It's a nice index for these purposes because you can decompose them additively into within states and between states. So the Thiel index kind of remained roughly, I mean, it went down a little bit, went back up in the 1990s. But if you look at where does most of the variation comes from, most of the variation is between states. Right? And a little bit is within states, so within school districts of a state, but most of the variation in terms of expenditure inequality is coming between states in the US. Okay, so what are the variations like? You get New Jersey spending $10,000 per pupil, New York spending about $9,500, and then on the other side you have Utah and Mississippi and Alabama spending something in the vicinity of $4,000. So there's this huge variation in public school spending per pupil. So is there some connection here? And if a kid is going to be born in a school and going to a school district where the school district's actually spending $4,000 as opposed to $9,000 or $10,000, is there going to be an impact in terms of the ability to advance up the income distribution? That's kind of the central question we're after here.
Controlling for price level variation?
No, not here. We're not. We should. It's on the agenda, but we're not. We do find, though, in the model, there's going to be very strong diminishing returns. So clearly, the first few dollars are going to make a huge difference. And if you're going to get horse riding lessons, if you're going to a school in New Jersey, it's not going to have much of an impact, both in the data and in the model. So it is going to kind of capture that.
So can I ask one question? So the public funding, do private providers receive any public funding, like in a state? Like, is it possible that half of the cost?
They do receive some. I don't know if it's as high as a half. But they do.
Variation?
There is variation in that. We couldn't find anything systematic across the states to use in our model. If we could, we would use information. That's similar to the answer to Jim's question. Okay, so there are three main systems that have been used during the time that these kids actually went to school. Full state funding. So this is financed by statewide taxes. I'm going to describe this in detail. We're going to model this. There's going to be a foundation program where there's going to be a minimum amount of public spending that's guaranteed. and you can top it up at the district level if you so chose. And then there's an equalization program where you have a targeted revenue that's based on a tax base that people vote on. And then either you pay in or you don't pay in into the system. Okay, so we'll describe these two systems in the first place. So what got me going at least is when Shetty first presented the data, there's very little correlation between educational spending and rank correlation. So we hear...
In public schools, let's just be careful, I just want to clarify. The state plays a role, but local districts are huge here, right?
True.
And that varies in different parts of the
True.
country. So that's why.
And we're going to capture that in our model.
Okay, so that, there are a lot of decentralized districts, but more state support is like in the south, I think, right?
Yep, no, that's true.
The northern areas, much more of these townships and so forth. So that leads to a very different kind of political economy going on.
Right.
In the state, and even different forms of finance, right?
Right, and in some sense, the goal of the paper is try to capture that. So we're going to have a system, for instance, in the foundation system, the way the model is going to work is you're going to vote at the state level to decide what the state-specific tax is, and then the district can top it off with a district-specific tax. Right? So rich districts can choose to spend a little more by topping up the...
Just like the role of the district is more diminished, I think, in some of the southern states as opposed to the northern states where you actually have, right?
You'll see what the model is, and you can tell me what yeah. No, it is true. I think the model does try to capture the essence of that, and you can tell me if it does a good enough a job of capturing that. It depends on the income distribution in a state. As you state, that's going to play a very important role. Okay, so the overall correlation between, say, the rank slope and public school spending, there's not much there. It's not statistically significant. But imagine you were to categorize them into two groups, where the blue dots are going to be the states that are on a foundation program, and the crosses are going to be the ones in an equalization program. You find a stronger correlation, certainly in the equalization program, and a statistically significant one in the foundation program. So maybe categorizing them this way and analyzing the differences in these school policies, the way they vary across states, could be important to model. Okay, so here's just an example where we just took two states that seem similar in many respects. Again, on the x-axis, we're going to plot... I got to go. Median household income. I wanted to make sure it's household income. And on the y-axis is the rank. Right? So two states that are similar in many respects, Colorado and Georgia, they are very similar in terms of number of school districts, the level of school spending, and educational policies is also fairly similar. And the rank slope coefficient is very different. Okay? And the distribution of public school spending, if you look at it, public school spending per pupil in Colorado and Georgia is also quite different. There's a much stronger correlation between household income and the rank, say, in Georgia than, say, it is in Colorado. Okay, so economic environment. So effectively a three-period model. It's going to be a first period in which the parents living for 18 years as the kid is attached. The school districts are going to decide on how much to consume, how much to invest in their children. There's going to be both public and private. In the second and third year periods of their life is going to be 6 years. And so we'd be able to measure earnings when they're 30, which is what it is in the data. Children can decide on their own consumption and human capital accumulation. So the idea being in the first 18 years, that's like spending on elementary and secondary education. In the third period would be college if they so chose. That would be in the time allocation decision. They could supplement it. And then the next 6 years is going to be OJT, on-the-job training.
Do you have any information on variation in tracking within the district?
I don't.
Do you have any sense of how much that might matter?
I don't. Honestly, I don't. I should look into that. We will. So there's a continuum of individuals. In a state S, there are going to be N districts, each indexed by J, and each having an income of YSJ. So we're going to think about a representative individual in a school district. So there's going to be no heterogeneity within a school district. Okay? There's going to be heterogeneity across school districts within the state, and you're going to see how the model again plays out. There's going to be 15,000 school districts, so we're going to model all of them in terms of their choices and then take them to the data, state by state. Okay, here are the technologies. In some sense, this is important. Okay, so in the first period of life, this is going to be the 18-year period. The child, the human capital of the child, C for a child, S in a state, and J in a district, in the second period is going to depend on ability. X is going to stand for private resources, and X bar is going to stand for public resources. Okay, so we're not going to assume they're perfect substitutes. We're going to assume that they're Cobb-Douglas. In the second and third period, we have a pretty standard Ben-Porath type model. Okay, very standard, and lots of people have estimated it, including like Heckman, Lochner, and Tabor, and so we have numbers from there that we can kind of use. But we're going to assume, in addition to having time as an input in the production of human capital, there's also going to be goods inputs in the production of human capital. Okay? And I guess implicit in here is that the depreciation rate is 0. So you're going to walk into the second period with the human capital you've acquired. This is the amount of human capital you're going to produce. Depends on your ability, the amount of time, and the amount of goods that gets put in. Okay. And the public resources, X bar that's going to appear in this model, is the level of public resources is going to be determined by the school finance system in place in that state at that particular point in time.
So parental education is playing no role in one.
Parental education is going to play a role in terms of its determination of ability. So what we're going to have is ability is going to have a random component, but ability is also going to depend on the schooling of the parent. So the parent's going to play 2 roles. One is directly affecting the ability of the child, if you want to think about it as genetics or stuff that you learn in the first 6 years of life, and then the income of the parent is going to matter, because that's going to determine how much in terms of X's the parent can buy.
It's like you have a separate technology now for the A.
I'm sorry?
You have a separate technology for the A sub C S.
Right, the ability, yes. You're right. But that's exogenous. In a sense, it's given by the schooling of the parent. The schooling of the parent is not a decision that we model. So, Marco.
So you're going to have preference for inequality that is going to give you some demand for
Redistribution.
Why do you need the Cobb-Douglas for the human capital of the children in equation 1? That seems a pretty counterfactual assumption.
I know, Jim was giving me grief about having perfect substitutes in another paper, so we put this in. Actually, the motivation in some sense comes from Del Boca, Flynn, and Wiswall, who've estimated these kinds of technologies, and it fits the data pretty well. It actually is true that if you can add them up and have them as perfect substitutes, it does fit the data worse than this version of the model in terms of rank. Because in some sense, what it's saying is you have this horrible school district, you can completely neutralize it. Being able to completely neutralize it doesn't seem to want to fit the data. Now, you might say, I think I ought to be able to do it, but that's the short answer.
Do you not identify like a CES type?
We were hoping to take, so the CES that we wanted, which we think is actually important, we actually know is important, is the CES between early and late. So if you and Betsy give me a number, I can put that in, right? And that would be pretty easy to do. But I don't think a CES here is going to play that important a role. But I don't know if we can identify.
Going to extreme perfect complements versus subset will give you a pretty big difference. You can play with it.
We could play with it, that's true.
I don't know whether you
We could do
can
some.
identify it, but
It will be hard
essentially
to.
posing it to be a one elasticity.
Right, that's fair. All right, so school district preferences is what Marco was kind of alluding to, is it's going to contain, you're going to get utility from your own consumption, and then children's utility in the following periods is going to be a function of ability, their human capital, and G is going to be the gift that they're going to get from the parent. Okay, so this is what Chris was after in terms of money versus time. Depending on the ability of the kid, you're going to invest a lot or very little, and then give G if you're altruistic. So that's fairly standard. So the parent cares about the utility of the child as opposed to some component of the utility, which is something that a lot of these models like Becker and Tomes might feature. The aspect that we're adding that we need in order to match the data in terms of the variation, enormous variation in public school spending across states, is the disutility from inequality. And that's this term right here. So we're going to assume, this is based on Alesina and Giuliano, and where they think about this taste for redistribution across countries in order to kind of match why one country has a very different taste for redistribution than another. So we're going to assume that the school district, J, cares about the coefficient of variation on the child's human capital. Okay, so the parents' preferences, the school district preferences, are going to be given by utility from consumption, an altruistic parameter theta times the utility of the child, and then some coefficient, which is state-specific, times disutility from the child. Okay, so it's not that, I guess in some sense it's important to match the variation in educational spending. It does a much better job of getting the distribution. We don't think it affects the bottom line figure at the end of the day, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the very end. Okay, so in some sense, the parent here is waking up and saying, depending on the ability of the kid and my degree of altruism, I want to invest a lot in the kid, but if that leads to a huge spread in terms of inequality, I might inhibit myself from doing so. But I'll just give cash to the kid, and the kid will grow up and then invest in himself or herself.
What if the degree about which is different across states?
Across states? We never thought of that. We could try that. Which in some sense might be the reason why they might want to redistribute, and that's a good point. We could certainly try that. Rather than loading up in A to S, we can load it up here and see what happens. Yep. Okay, so the child's going to earn a wage, which is going to depend upon, this particular construct that we have. We're not going to model migration. What Jim was asking about the previous paper. We're not going to model it either. That would be way too complicated to do. But the rates of migration, lifetime migration, varies considerably across states. Okay, so imagine the WS is going to be the wage in your state, and WUS is the overall wage in the United States. We have lifetime migration numbers from the Census Bureau, and so we're going to hit them with the lifetime migration numbers. So clearly one of the limitations is when we change policies and we do counterfactuals, you would obviously think that people migrate and out-migrate at different rates. Our model doesn't capture that. To the extent that you think that a lot of the migration across states is really preference-driven, which is what my colleagues Kennan and Walker believe in their Econometrica paper, or actually show in their Econometrica paper, I think it's kind of okay.
But you're also not allowed migration across districts.
Right.
That is the-
That's probably more severe than migration across states. That's a good point. I agree.
So if you did it, you ended up with T-group sorting.
Yep. You could neutralize everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what's going on, though, in the local districts and a lot of schools. I mean, it's sorting is the big question. Neighborhoods sort, and that's a huge source of inequality.
Right.
I don't think that's an innocuous comment.
No, but we're doing, so if we had a heterogeneity within a school district, we can think about who moves, who doesn't, but we don't. There's a representative person.
Locally, I mean, they're going to go to school districts, they're going to buy property. You see that in
True.
housing value.
No.
So, I mean, this is well studied, though. I think
Yeah.
this component. Right?
No, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree. That's a point well taken.
Yeah. And so even if you have, like, some kind of national policy, you still have sorting in neighborhoods, there might be peer effects and so forth that lead to, and higher schooling quality, it seems, and because of the difference between the inner city schools here and, say, New Trier in the north
Right.
side.
Right. No, we don't have that in the model. I wouldn't even begin to know how to put that in terms of migration across states and across individuals within a state. Sorry. Okay, so the rest of it is pretty standard. This is going to be utility from consumption in the second period, discounted value of consumption in the third period, and you have a lifetime budget constraint. Okay. So full state funding. So 3 different ways of funding. So here, the public school spending is going to be financed by a statewide income tax. X bar is basically going to denote the average spending in a school district. J, which is going to be the same in any other district, J prime, and X bar. So here, migration wouldn't really matter because you could migrate to another school district. You'll get exactly the same X bar, which is going to come from taxes times the average income in the state, the mean income in the state. So here's going to be the school district's problem where consumption plus investments in the kid plus the gift to the kid is going to be after tax income. Okay? And then we're going to assume that this is going to be determined by majority voting. So that's kind of what's costly computationally. Right? So here there's only one level of voting. Given our assumptions on preferences, which is going to be CRRA and separable, preferences are going to be single peaked in tau. And so the equilibrium tax rate must satisfy the condition that those above this particular median level in some sense has to be greater than or equal to half, and those below that less than also greater than or equal to half. Okay? Foundation. This is the program that most states kind of use. So the minimum level of public school spending is funded by a statewide tax, tau, that's guaranteed. And then in addition, school districts can spend more by imposing more in terms of local taxes. Okay, that's going to be tau L. And so what you're going to get in terms of X bar is going to be what you're going to get at the statewide level and what you're going to top up at the district level.
Aren't there lots of states that also provide each district with incentives to spend more?
Yes.
And that's in the equalization kind of program. And that's the third kind of program that we're going to have, where they're going to pick the tax base.
Okay.
Yeah. But you're right that there are some minor variations in the even within the foundation program, but at least the analysis we've looked at and the data we've looked at suggests that that's really tiny in comparison to the actual spending that kind of goes on.
But the tax base here is on income.
It's on income. It's not housing.
So I think there's a lot to it.
It does vary a lot.
It's on final goods,
True.
or most of the local district is property tax.
Right.
And so that would be like, you know, a separate issue about demand for housing.
I agree. That would be pretty easy to do. Incorporating a housing stock and a version of the model in which you have a demand for housing and the taxes on housing with kind of homothetic preferences. That would be fairly easy to do. What would be harder is migration. Yeah. And sort, yeah.
But that seems like it would be key, because, you get high quality on your local school, but you get it back in some sense, right?
Right.
So it's not really going to affect in a different way. You're getting the good and sending it back. So I guess how local it is would actually really affect, I think, the strength of the tax effect.
Right.
Because otherwise it might be big disincentives. I tax one part of the state to transfer it to another, and that's going to create disincentives to live in that state and produce part of that state. I don't know, I just think it's kind of central to the discussion of local finance.
So I think it's something that we can look at more in terms of data to rebut the comment. But I think we're looking at an average kid growing up in each district and asking what the intergenerational rank correlation is going to be, right? So you may well be right that even there the selection is large. My own sense is it's not, but I just haven't looked at the data enough to kind of answer that question.
Yeah, think about that you have perfect sorting within districts, that everybody is alike in the district, within a district.
Within a district, there's a
So then the sorting across districts or the movement across that's not really an issue, because
right.
But across states, then I guess would be.
That's what given the model, that's absolutely what I believe. I was thinking about Jim's comment as in the spirit of imagine you had heterogeneity in your model. In that case, the criticism would apply. I don't think in this model.
Would it be like heterogeneity and segregation, or like how dispersed these districts are?
Yeah.
How homogeneous they are, or inhomogeneous they are.
Right.
That's why I just think it might actually be first order important. I don't know, just empirically, I would look at it.
So the foundation program is going to work as follows. First, you give the tau. Given the tau, the school district is going to solve its maximization problem. And then based on these choices, the school district is going to choose the tau, right? So you get to choose at two levels. First, you get to pick the tau L, and then you get to pick the tau S. Okay, so you pick the tau S that's going to give you the tax that's going to hit everybody. And then you pick the tau L in your own school district that maximizes your own utility. So finally, we have the equalization program where the state government is going to set the Z, and that's going to be determined by median voting. So ZS is going to be like the tax base. Okay, so the actual tax revenue is going to be smaller than the revenue you're going to get based on your own tax base, and the difference is going to be funded by a statewide tax. So the amount of spending that goes in a particular district is going to be given by your locally chosen district level tax times the times the ZS, which is constant across districts within a particular state. If you're a poor income district, but otherwise, if you're rich, if you're higher than ZS, then you're going to get that times your own income in that particular school district. And this is just a condition that's going to satisfy tax revenue. Okay, so here again, given the ZS, given the tax base, the school district is going to solve its optimization problem. And then based on this, each school districts are going to choose the ZS on the basis of median voting. Okay, so this problem is a little more computationally involved because relative to many of the other papers in this literature, the model is dynamic. It also has heterogeneity in terms of ability, so there's uncertainty here. So it's a little more involved kind of computationally, and it's not necessarily the median income guy who's going to be the person deciding what the tax rate's going to be. Okay, so in terms of the model elements, so parents matter in terms of income. The amount of income that they have determines the amount of investments in their kids. The amount of schooling that they possess determines the amount of the ability in some sense of the kid before the kid goes to school. States are going to matter because the public school finance systems and the distribution of income and inequality over redistribution as well. Okay, the district you're living in is going to matter because the local tax is going to be chosen by this representative individual, and this ability of the students are going to matter in terms of these decisions. Okay, so we're going to assume CRRA, type utility, pretty standard functional forms. This one is obviously non-standard, so we'd be estimating kappa. We'd be estimating this squiggly parameter. And we're going to assume that alpha is also equal to zeta, so that the utility functions of the parents and the kids are the same. But this is, I think, what Jim was asking about before. So your own income in a school district is going to depend on your wage multiplied by some exponential factor of phi times S, which is the schooling of your mom. Okay? And then the child's learning ability is going to depend upon the schooling of the parent and some shock, which is log normal. Okay, so this is the component that another source of variation across school districts. Okay, so in terms of estimated parameters, so the three parameters that we're going to estimate that are invariant across states are going to be kappa, which is going to be this coefficient right here on the disutility from inequality, and then the two parameters on the private spending and public spending, which are going to be gamma 1 and gamma 2. So those are basically the same across states. The parameters that are going to vary across states are going to be the disutility from inequality and the mean invariance associated with that shock. Okay? So we're going to estimate, the way we're going to do it is rather than taking all states, we're going to estimate these 6 parameters using Washington State, which has full state funding. So that where everyone in every district gets exactly the same spending level. And then we're going to use other sets of moments to estimate these state by state. Okay, so the moments we're going to use based on those sources that I just described are like average public school spending, child income, the coefficient of variation, some measure of the distribution of child family income, and the correlation between school district income and child family income. So we're trying to not match the rank. The hope is that the rank is an outcome of the model and see if we can kind of come close to fitting the data. Okay. So for Washington State, we would use the first 6 to get all 6 moments, all 6 parameters, and then for others, we just use a combination. Okay, so this plays an important role. So this is the coefficient of disutility. For instance, it's really high in Colorado, 0.8. It's really high in Virginia. It's really small in like Washington or say California. So California, for instance, is going to have a high rate of mobility. This, in some sense, is going to play somewhat of a role. This mu s and sigma s variation is much smaller. So in fact, we could shut that down kind of completely and have the same shock process for every state. That doesn't play as important a role. Okay, so the estimated value for kappa, this is the CRRA coefficient on the disutility from inequality. It's almost the same as the disutility, the CRRA coefficients on own consumption or the consumption of the kid. These are 2 coefficients on private spending and public spending. Okay, so this was the answer to Steve's question that you have strong diminishing returns with respect to spending here. Okay, so spending matters, but after a certain point, it kind of tapers off.
So what happens if you drop this disutility? The disutility bothers me because it looks like you're saying inequality is related to inequality. I mean, it's a function of some measure of inequality is related to some other measure of inequality, right?
Right.
And so that seems almost tautological, or close to tautological.
No, it's how would one account for this variation in spending across states? So the question.
It's an economy, if you look more finely at what's going on in the state.
It's really hard. It's kind of like accounting for differences in schooling that we were talking about. You need like something in preferences, a stigma cost.
Well,
like I think you have maybe.
No, I'm just wondering here in this model, if I dump it, how badly do you do?
Oh no, so in terms of the variation in public school spending across states, we'd get like 50% of the variation if we shut this down.
You lose 50%.
We lose 50% if we shut it down.
But you do agree that it's close to tautological, right?
I don't like it a whole lot, but I just don't see how to explain this. So do we want a counterfactual simulation from a version of the model that fits the data really well and then kind of ask what does it take to fit it really well? In some sense, it's a residual. Right? So we're asking, without this, what can be fit? We can fit about half. We can go much further by having this in the model. In terms of the bottom line decomposition exercise, which is to say, how much of the variation in rank can be accounted for by the variation in educational policy, the answer is almost the same, whether you do it with this or without it.
Clearly, it would be far worth it if you allowed sorting by. If there's heterogeneity in that characteristic and people sorted across states, then it would be tautological.
Then it would be tautological. Yeah, then it would definitely be tautological.
It's really a measure.
Well, at least assuming it's the same everywhere. So.
The distaste, yeah. But the variation, the argument
Oh,
is
yeah,
the same
no,
everywhere.
yeah.
So.
No, so we could certainly the other thing which I don't know if this is more palatable. We could assume that this is the same everywhere. Right? We could see how far it goes. So there are 2 elements to it. One is to say, people dislike inequality, but it's the same no matter where you live. The other is to say it varies across states. So one thing we could do, which we haven't, is to just assume that this parameter is the same in every state. Then it's not subject to that criticism, I think. Okay, so how does, even so, so we do pretty well in terms of child family income. So this is the predictions of the model and data. This is model, and it lies in the 45-degree line. So that's pretty nice. It's still not that easy to nail public school spending per pupil. Okay, we're getting close, but not quite, exact. Okay, so here are some selected targeted moments that we've done a pretty good job of matching, because we want to match not just spending per pupil, but the variance in spending per pupil, like the coefficient of variation in spending per pupil. So you look at states like Michigan, for instance, you have a very strong correlation between parents' income on the x-axis and public school spending on the y-axis. And it's flatter in, say, other states like Oregon. Okay, and this is going to play an important role in one of our counterfactuals if we were to give everyone full state funding. So take Michigan, for example. You have a lot of districts that are poor. So if you were to shift to full state funding, you can have a huge impact in terms of the rank-rank correlation.
I thought they did do that.
I'm sorry?
I thought Michigan did switch.
They might have, but we're looking at data at the time when the kids were growing up in the same time Chetty's sample. Yeah. So maybe we should look at the rank to see if the predictions of the model accord with the evidence, but if we'll have to wait a few years to know what the income of these kids are going to be in 2040 in order to answer that question definitively. Right, but the distribution is going to play a very important role in our counterfactuals. If, say, relative to that, you were to take New Jersey, where you don't have this concentration here at the bottom, but it's kind of spread out, you're going to find much less of an impact when you switch New Jersey to full state funding. Okay, so that's just a brief preview of kind of the results we're going to show. The other interesting finding in Chetty et al. Is the linearity of rank. So one of the things they show is, unlike many other measures, if you measure this rank correlation, it's linear. It looks pretty darn close to linear at different states and across the United States across time. And so Michigan and Ohio, it looks pretty good. New Jersey, it looks not as good, but it's most of the model's predictions here seem pretty close to linear. I think it has to do with homotheticity. So in terms of Marco's, the question you asked about x plus x bar, I don't think you would get this.
New Jersey's an interesting case. You'd be nuts to send your kids to school in Newark. Or any of the other big cities of New Jersey, right? And that's not being captured here. So what's missing?
Migration?
No, that can't be it by itself, because obviously funding is not the only issue that's determining the quality of the school.
Right. So quality of peers, quality of neighborhoods, yeah, that's probably more first order than migration. Yeah. In some sense, that's all. I think a lot of it is captured in that A term, because it's in some sense it's a residual, right? I think in terms of the fitting exercise, I think it's fine. I think where it gets a little tricky is when you do the counterfactuals, because when you change the systems, the policies in place, you would expect the A to change, and that's what this model doesn't kind of capture. But.
So one factor that is interesting is this rank correlation. Yeah, there is the absolute value. Did you look at what your model implies for absolute value?
You mean like the IGEs, or?
Just the level of public school spending. My understanding is people were pretty unhappy with the California system of full state funding because it led to bad schools, because people were not willing to spend
as much.
Is that something that you replicate?
We do replicate that. So we do replicate spending, but this is something that we don't try to fit. This is something that we actually get as a byproduct of the estimation, but the spending is something we actually force the model to fit.
No, but they equalized, I thought, in California, wasn't it? It wasn't just the level. I mean, I thought they basically forbade these kind of private sorting arrangements.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the California schools are on the top of the country, I think about 40 years ago. And these equalization, it became difficult to actually have individual parents contribute to the quality.
Right. And
that's again, I mean, that is equalizing.
In California. So we do have California in our sample. It is one of the most mobile states in the Chetty view of the world. It's in our simulations, it also turns out to be one of the most mobile states. So we'd actually do a pretty good job of capturing the rank in, say, California, Ohio, Michigan, I think even Oregon and New Hampshire. New Jersey is probably higher than where it should be. It should be a little bit lower, and Georgia should be quite a bit higher. So those are the two states that we need to work on to figure out why we're not quite able to nail it.
Sorry, but are you mentioning California because you're going to attribute a lot of preference for redistribution in California, or is it?
It's primarily coming from full state funding. It's primarily coming from policies. In fact, you can give them exactly the same disutility parameter as another state, which is Washington, which is our baseline benchmark, and you get pretty much the same results. So, so policies do play a dominant role. In terms of, say, for instance, California and Washington, very high rates of mobility compared to the rest of the economy.
How much of California is high levels of immigration from Mexico?
In the data?
Yeah. Having first generation Americans.
There are studies that have actually looked at people who've been here. And you do find, really high rates of mobility. But it's not the same kind of data as Chetty's data, so it's not without that kind of authenticity. But, there are people who've looked at subgroups that are pretty mobile in terms of schooling, in terms of other metrics. But, I don't know if Chetty's data allows us to, talk separately about immigrants and non-immigrants. Okay, so just a couple of quick counterfactuals. So suppose you give people the same disutility from inequality, there are modest changes. It's not a big deal at the end of the day. You do get, California going up. You do get Washington pretty much the same. New Jersey comes down a little bit. So the spread in terms of rank gets smaller, but not by much. So I would say that this utility plays a role, but it's modest in terms of accounting for the variation in rank across states. Okay, so how about if you were to switch to, say, full state funding? So imagine you were to have these states that had these different programs such as foundation or full state funding, and you're now going to move them to full state funding. In many of these states, you get big effects. For instance, in Michigan, which is the graph we were talking about, where in Michigan you have a lot of poor districts. So if you look at these 10 states we've computed, it would have a huge effect in terms of their investments in education, and consequently huge effects in terms of their mobility. So rank falls dramatically, or mobility improves dramatically if you were to switch. Ohio, again, big effects. Okay, states like New Jersey that have kind of a nice spread in terms of the distribution, which is what we saw there, not much of an effect. So the bottom line, my takeaway from here is, the policies kind of have a big impact, especially in states that have an unequal distribution of income to begin with. So it's the interaction between the distribution of spending and the policies that plays a very important role. Marco.
So the addition of my comment, you say, well, mobility improves dramatically in Michigan, mostly because now the good kids in Michigan are now going to get a good education because none of that.
Yeah, and the bad kids are getting a better education.
They're getting, maybe.
They are. We checked. They are voting for a higher level.
Spending in public education drops dramatically, so I don't know, improving is tricky to measure at that point.
No. So you're right. I shouldn't make a value judgment in terms of whether it's a better allocation or not, and I've resisted, and you're absolutely right to catch me on that. But in terms of thinking about what the impact would be of that policy in terms of rank, it's the subtle interaction between this distribution and the policy that plays an important role. That's really the point. But point well taken. I'm not trying to say this is a good thing or a bad thing. But in terms of the rich parents, they can invest in private resources, and they could give a lot of G to their kids, who can grow up and go to better colleges instead of as a trade-off between this poor public school that they're going to live in. So we do allow a channel for adjustment even for rich parents.
Yeah, but it's called Douglas.
It is Cobb Douglas. But the shares of the the OJT are higher than the shares here. So the impact of spending later in life is actually pretty high. Okay, so intergenerational mobility, so in terms of switch to a full state funding, you actually have a huge impact, especially for states that have a widespread in terms of the distribution of income to begin with. Okay, so I think we're still in the process. We've estimated the model for like 25 states, so we're still trying to wrap it up for the rest of the states. But at least for what we've done so far, it suggests that public school spending can account for about 30% of the variation in intergenerational mobility. So if you give everyone a switch to a full state funding system, this is the kind of impact it's going to have on intergenerational mobility. So the fact that overall levels of spending and rank are not that highly correlated, shouldn't give one pause to think that educational spending doesn't kind of matter. The distribution plays a dominant role. And all three aspects seem to play an important role, but it's this interaction between policy and distributions that play a dominant role.
Where I go. I just want to say this was, as you just saw from the presentation, a really interesting paper to read, and gave me lots of things to think about and ponder, some philosophical thoughts in the last week. So, because Anant's usually quite good at presenting things, I'm not going to spend a lot of time redeveloping what they did. Just in case you missed it, and what they're looking at is the role and level and variation of public school spending, what that variation and level has on intergenerational mobility across states. And then, I think more interestingly, how various types of funding systems affect public school spending choices, and then this intergenerational mobility. And then lastly, what happens when all states adopt a centralized funding model. So what I want to do to try to understand the mechanisms that are going on in this model, and hopefully I understood the mechanisms, if not this will be a short discussion. I want to start by taking a bunch of things out of the model, so it's more bare bones. So if we assume that we don't have any ability differences of kids, that we don't have this taste for equality, which I think is interesting, but since I haven't really thought about it very much, it was harder for me to think about what role that was playing, especially, well, centrally with the political economy. Okay, so the only heterogeneity left will be the income of the parent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this simple version of the model with just two of the funding mechanisms that they looked at. The state funding, which is the one that it seems is the most interesting because that's the one we want to think about what happens if we switch to that. And then the foundation system, partly because it's easier for me to think about, was less complicated, and more, most states have the foundation funding. And I'm going to skip the third funding mechanism. Okay, with state funding, so first there's this decision on how much to privately invest in your kids, given whatever the state is doing. And then there's the decision on the political economy for statewide. Okay, so if you look at the problem, given the public spending, the household has to choose what the private spending is going to be. And remember, all kids here are going to have the same ability. So what they're going to do is equate the return to private spending to the return to passing this transfer on to their kid at G. This is going to give us the same private spending for everybody because there aren't going to be any ability differences, and it's going to be independent of the income of the parent. So all kids in this situation are going to have the same early private investment. And then if we go to the next level where we're deciding on voting over the tax level, or whatever the public funding is, that's going to be interchangeable. People are going to vote so that the marginal benefit of the public, that's the X bar, relative to the private, is going to equal whatever their income is relative to the mean. So there's a little bit of a distortion that comes in with this redistribution that's going on through taxation. So if I'm low income and I think about what happens if we increase the tax rate, what do I pay? I pay my own Y, but I get back the mean in terms of spending. So what happens is that if the median is equal to the mean in the state, then you're just going to have the marginal benefit of the public investment be the same as the private. If the median income is above the mean, then these individuals, it's more expensive for them to get this public investment. And so we're going to have the marginal return to the public investment is greater than the private, too little public input. And if the median is below the mean, we're going to have the opposite. We're going to have too much. I don't want to get into the too little, too much stuff, since that's obviously not a focus of this paper. Okay, so what happens under statewide funding here with no differences in ability? Everybody's got the same early investment, and then because of the way we're funding public investment, everybody has the same sorry, that's my own work. Everybody has the same public investment, so you end up with the same level of human capital when you enter into adulthood. Okay, so what that means is everybody has the same. The rank slope measure of intergenerational mobility is going to be 0. Okay, if we move on to the foundation funding, now there's going to be 3 levels. You have to figure out what you're going to do privately. Then you have to figure out as a district what the tax level is going to be at your district. And then you have to figure out at the state level what the tax level is going to be for the state. Okay, so the private decision is going to be the same as before. Given the total public spending, you equate the return private spending to the return to passing transfers to your kid. So given if everybody had the same public spending, they'll be doing the same thing privately. Now if you think about it at a school district level, remember these are homogeneous, so they're going to have the same income. So there's not going to be this desire to redistribute through taxation by the voters. So if we have statewide spending of tau S, these homogeneous districts are going to supplement with this tau L star. It'll be greater than 0 if whatever the base spending that's already happening at the state level is low enough that if they add on, they can equate these two marginal returns. And the reason why it's equating is because the districts have the same income. Everybody in the district has the same income. So the mean is going to be equal to the median. Okay, so given whatever the state decides to do statewide, all districts are going to choose the same, either 0 or they're going to have the same level of topping up. Okay, so voters then are going to choose the state level funding so that the marginal return to public investment over private investment is equal to whatever their income is relative to the mean. So again, we have this: if the median is below the mean, we're going to have more public spending. And if the median is above the mean, instead of having less public spending, these guys are going to say, screw it, we're not going to finance anything through the state level tax. We're going to do it all at the district level. Okay, but what that means is that it's all going to be happening at the district level, but because there's no ability differences, they're all going to be picking the same level of taxation. So in this case, you're going to end up having all of the state level, all the public funding either coming through tau S in that first bullet point, or all of it coming through tau L. But either way, all the kids in the state are going to have the same level of spending. So again, even under this foundation system, we're going to get all kids reaching adulthood with the same level of H2. Okay, so here's what happens if the median income is below the mean. It's not really that interesting, although I think the third point, I think dawned on me yesterday, that if the median income is below the mean, the state funding and the foundation funding will have the same outcome if you don't have ability differences. But the upshot is the rank slope measure of intergenerational mobility should still be 0 in this case because everybody has the same human capital. Okay, so as far as I could tell, I could have been wrong here, it didn't look like there were any credit market frictions, which is why all of this happens. So parental income isn't going to affect the private investment input. Political economy might affect things, but it's not going to affect it differentially. So it doesn't matter what your parent's income is for what the public spending is going to be. Okay, so we shouldn't see any differences in intergenerational mobility across states by income. Now, if you did have, which we probably do, differences in distribution of income across states so that the mean relative to the median isn't different in different states, you could have different levels. So you could end up with different H2s across states, but in terms of mobility, it's going to be the same. All right, so where do differences by parental income come from in this model that we just saw? So obviously I stripped it down. So if we bring back ability, efficient investments are going to be higher for higher ability kids. There's going to be an added wrinkle. This is why I took ability out, because it's really hard for me to be thinking about the redistribution motive of taxation and then adding in ability, because high ability parents are, if you're the median voter, are going to want more spending. Low ability parents are going to want less. And so that makes things a little bit trickier. But differences in intergenerational mobility that are going to come from this are not coming directly from parental income differences, but indirectly in how the kid ability is depending on the parent income. And here in this paper, we saw that exogenous function for how ability depends on parental schooling. Okay, so then you add in taste for equality. Could that be doing something? Yes, it can. But if you don't have ability differences, taste for equality isn't going to do anything because everybody's going to be the same. So the standard deviation is going to be 0. But if you add this in, basically what's going to happen is how can we increase, I don't know, make the rank slope go down? The one way to do it is to overinvest in low ability guys. Okay, those are the people who are going to have a lower human capital outcome. Okay, so that there's going to be that incentive. Okay, so then my question is, do we really think all the differences in human capital are due to child ability? They're not coming from income directly here, When we think about preferences for equality, driving higher statewide spending, so I care about people who live in the poorer part of town. Do I care about those kids because I think that they're low ability and we should invest in them, or do I care about them because I think there's something else going on that they're not getting the appropriate investments? And then if we think about this channel that's in this model about how ability differences are depending on parental schooling, do we want to think about this as an innate ability transmission, or is there some earlier period that's happening? In terms of the calibration, the one thing that I would say is that in this model, obviously the parameter that's going to be on public investment is going to be very important. And so I think, as Anant said, this is preliminary. It was hard for me to figure out exactly how things were getting pinned down in this framework. And especially, they estimate those parameters that are the same for all the states using Washington State, which is the state that has no variation in public spending. So I think it might be interesting to think about other states or including other states. As we already talked about in the discussion, there's private versus public inputs and the question of how substitutable they are, because we all know people who've taken their kids out of the public schools and completely privately educated them. And I think there's probably situations where there's people who do no private investment. And then we also talked a bit about mobility. And I think kind of there's the exit into the private system. And then there's also the ability to move to a different state. And in this model, if you happened to be in a state that had low spending, maybe because it was low ability, people, you would want, if you got forced to do statewide spending, you would want to move to a state, like high ability state, where there was higher spending. And then just one last thing I want to say. With this preference for equality, this was the philosophical issue I was having. I think that there's something to that. But what I thought was strange is thinking about how, if I think about investments in my kid, so I care about people other places, and I can imagine that might affect how I vote for public-wide spending. But I'm not sure it's going to affect my individual decision. So I think thinking of myself as sort of an atom in this world, and my kid is very small. I don't know if it's because I care about her a lot, or if it's because I think even if she does well, it's not really going to affect the overall mobility. So I don't know if there's something about thinking about that differently from the private decision versus the public decision. All right.
So quickly, I'm pretty sure I'll borrow the first 6 or 7 slides and almost paste it in the paper. That's a great way of introducing it. In terms of borrowing constraints, you're right, we don't have like short-term borrowing constraints, but effectively the G is non-negative. I should have stated that, so my apologies.
All right, sorry.
And that does play an important role when you can't borrow against
A lot of first order conditions that hold with equality.
I know. So yeah, in terms of the calibration, I think we could certainly try the complementarity between the X and the X bar. My own sense is the complementarity across time, which is what you and Lance estimate. That's the kind of thing that would play an even more dominant role. Like if the private X or the public X that you get early in life is much more important a determinant of income later in life, it's these critical periods of life, then you'd get a bigger bang in terms of switching to policies. I'll stop there.